Hi, I'm Kristen Call, and this is my presentation on case study number 4, which for the purposes of this assignment, I have named Calvin's case. Now, Calvin is 9 years old, and he's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. He comes to clinic half days, so he comes from 12:30 to 4:30 for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. His behavior of concern is verbal protest of daily living skills. So that's any instance of the client verbally stating a word, a phrase, or a sentence that hinders the onset of a daily living skill after demand was placed, except when it is made to gain information about the task, which we've kind of put in our non-examples here. So first, our examples are if the therapist places a demand, change your clothes, the client states no. That hinders that onset of that task. TX places the demand, brush your teeth. Client states, I'm not doing it. Those are all examples. Some non-examples are the client asking why after a demand is placed to do a daily living task, or he asks what is that? If he doesn't know what he's being asked to do, or he's kind of struggling to understand like why he's doing it, he's just trying to gain more information. We want to positively reinforce those behaviors to gain more information about a task. We don't want to extinguish those, so we put those in our non-examples. Response class is basically any response that differs. It might differ in topography, so what it looks like, what it sounds like, but it will produce the same effect on the environment. So for this, those examples that were listed, no, I'm not doing it. Another one I added was, I don't want to do that. Those would all fall under the same response class because they differ in topography, they sound different, they might look different, but they do produce the same effect on his environment, which is hindering that onset of the daily living skill. Now, rule-governed behavior is just verbally mediated rule that is basically insensitive to the immediate contingencies. So I've kind of put a list here. There's no immediate consequence to the behavior. So let's say you drive the speed limit every day because your mom told you if you don't, then you're going to get a ticket. You've never gotten a ticket, so there's no immediate consequence, right? And there's no immediate consequence of you putting on your seatbelt and necessarily getting reinforced by it. But that rule still applies. The response consequence delay should be over 30 seconds for it to be considered rule governed. So not immediate reinforcement. If I threw this pin at someone and immediately they yelled at me, that's that immediate consequence, and it's less than 30 seconds. So that would not be rule governed behavior. Behavior usually also changes without that reinforcement, and a large increase in the occurrence of the behavior might occur following if that behavior is reinforced. So if behavior is reinforced once, that behavior usually increases. No consequence, like I said before, of the behavior exists, but the rule still exists. Now, when I was reading through Cooper and they were talking about behavior contracts and contingency contracts, they were talking about how, yes, reinforcement is involved, but it's not as direct as it usually is. So me throwing a pen and someone yelling at me right away, it's not as direct. It's more like rule-governed behavior because it's larger than 30 seconds have passed, then the consequence might happen. That rule-governed behavior is involved in contingency contracts because a contract does describe a rule, and immediately after that rule, that contingency contract is put in place, that client has not necessarily ever had an immediate consequence for doing the behaviors that are in the contingency contract, but they're motivated to do those behaviors because of something they think might happen because the contract says, oh, well, you can go to this baseball game if you go 5 days without yelling, things of that nature. That's why it kind of falls under that rule-governed behavior. So rule-governed behavior versus contingency-shaped behavior, I'm going to kind of go over that since it can get a little confusing between the two. Rule-governed behavior is basically rules, laws, contracts. If you behave in a certain way because you read it somewhere or someone told you to, you saw it on TV, things of that nature, then that is rule governed behavior. Contingency shaped behavior is shaped by consequences, right? By those immediate consequences. So it's usually based off of past experiences, behaving in a certain way because you come into direct contact with the consequence of that behavior. So using the speeding ticket as an example, if you got a speeding ticket and that's why you no longer speed, that's contingency shaped behavior. If you don't speed because you were told you'll get a ticket, but you've never gotten one before, that's rule governed behavior. So the contingency contract, when it's immediately like first applied, it falls under rule governed behavior until it's been reinforced multiple times. Then it might turn into contingency shaped behavior. But first, as an intervention, when you first introduce the contingency contract, it falls under rule governed behavior. So for the intervention, we did choose a contingency or behavior contract. The contract was made between Calvin and his BCBA. We didn't state the behavior of concern in the contract. We wanted him to focus on the behaviors we wanted to increase, those replacement behaviors. So those were asking for a break, asking for help, asking to do a task later. If he was engaging in those behaviors instead of engaging in the verbal protest during the daily living tasks for 5 consecutive days, then he got to choose an activity for his reinforcement board that included a baseball game, a movie, laser tag, to engage in after the 5th successful day in which he successfully completed the behavior contract. So both Calvin and the BCBA signed this contract and it was implemented. We chose a behavior contract because Calvin did display the skills to perform the target behavior to increase. He displayed that he had the skills to ask for a break, ask for help, all of those things that we wanted to increase. If he didn't have those skills, we would want to shape those first before implementing the contract. And then he just lacked the motivation to do those daily living skills. It wasn't necessarily that he couldn't do it. He could get dressed, brush his teeth, do the dishes. He could do all of these things we were asking him to do. He just lacked the motivation, which is why we chose behavior contract to help build that motivation. He was able to choose his reinforcement. So he chose the baseball game. He chose laser tag, all of those things on that list. So he was motivated by them. He also had the cognitive ability to understand and follow through with the rules in the contract, which is a big piece. If the client doesn't understand the rules of the contract and is not able to, then a behavior contract would not be useful in this case, but for Calvin it was. The outcome was that we did see a decrease in his verbal protest of daily living tasks, which was shown through event recording. So we had a frequency clicker, and his graph showed a dramatic decrease once we implemented the intervention. And we also saw an increase in his advocation skills, which were being tracked on a data sheet. And we noticed that he had more self-monitoring skills, which usually comes along with that behavior contract, right? Helps that self-monitoring. So he was able to kind of look intrinsically, and he was motivated by maybe the baseball game. So he started showing those replacement behaviors and was able to do that himself without us prompting him through displaying those replacement behaviors. He also, at the end of this intervention, met the discharge criteria to transition back into a school setting, which was awesome. The obstacles we did face during this intervention were that Calvin did go on 2 separate week-long vacations during the intervention, which delayed his reinforcement even more. So he earned his reinforcement, and that 5th day that he would have gone to a baseball game or whatever he chose, he went on a week-long vacation and then wasn't reinforced until he came back. And then a couple weeks later, he went on another week-long vacation. So it kind of also delayed his progress. So we weren't exactly sure how well he'd progress, if he'd come back and it would be kind of like we'd have to start over. Things of that nature, or if it would have progressed more quickly if he didn't go on those vacations. Also, with contingency contracting, when some reinforcement options were not available, we had to pick a different option. So if a baseball game wasn't available, he had to pick something else. So it was not always reinforced with his highest MO. And this is my references.